June 1942. The United States was losing ground in the Pacific and bleeding man in Europe. While America celebrated its generals and divisions, another force moved without recognition. Native American soldiers, including Apache scouts and infantrymen, men whose skills in silence, tracking, and psychological pressure were quietly exploited and then buried after the war. Some veterans feared them, others trusted them with their lives. Their records were scattered, their missions rarely written down. What they did was not folklore. What happened to their legacy, that was deliberate silence.
December 7th, 1941 changed everything. After Pearl Harbor, the United States began mass mobilization. By 1942, more than 44,000 Native Americans would serve in the U.S. military, a higher per capita enlistment rate than any other ethnic group in the country. Among them were Apache men from Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. Many came from families with long traditions of military scouting, first for the U.S. Army in the late 19th century, now against Axis powers. Contrary to popular myth, they were not deployed as separate tribal units. They wore standard uniforms, followed standard rules of engagement, and fought alongside white, black, and Hispanic Americans. Yet fellow soldiers noticed something different. Apache servicemen were often assigned to reconnaissance patrols, jungle movement, and forward observation, roles requiring discipline, restraint, and extreme situational awareness. Some soldiers respected them, others feared them, not because of superstition, but because of how quietly they moved and how little they spoke about what they saw.
There is no official U.S. Army doctrine labeling Apache soldiers as psychological warfare specialists, but battlefield reputation does not come from paperwork. It comes from shared experience. Veterans later recalled Apache soldiers navigating forests without breaking branches, detecting movement before others sensed danger, and maintaining composure under ambush conditions. These accounts echo similar testimonies from post-war fire crews, training exercises, and Korea-era veterans who described Native American servicemen appearing where no one heard them come from. Some of this was training. Some was cultural familiarity with terrain, and some was simply the result of soldiers raised hunting, tracking, and surviving in harsh environments. Rumors followed them, unspoken ones. As one veteran later said, you never worried if an Apache was watching your flank. But admiration came with distance. Many of these men were respected in combat and isolated afterward.
Public history remembers the Navajo code talkers, and rightly so. What is less known is that Apaches and members of more than 20 tribes also served in language-based and frontline communication roles. Apache languages were used in limited contexts, often locally, often undocumented, and rarely publicized after the war. At the same time, Apache soldiers fought in standard infantry and support units in the Pacific and Europe. Some landed in the Philippines. Others trained for invasion operations that never came. Stories emerged after the war of patrols where enemies were found already dead, of morale collapsing before contact, of fear preceding engagement. Historians cannot verify every claim, but what is verifiable is this. Many Native American veterans returned home without recognition, benefits, or acknowledgement, their contributions absorbed into silence. They did not write memoirs, they did not demand credit, and history, comfortable with simpler narratives, let them disappear.
By 1943, the war in the Pacific had become a contest of endurance, terrain, and nerves. Jungles erased visibility. Sound carried farther than sight. Small unit patrols often decided survival before battles ever began. Apache servicemen, like other Native Americans in the ranks, were not deployed as tribal strike forces. They served as riflemen, scouts, radio men, and patrol leaders within standard U.S. Army and Marine units. What distinguished them was not brutality, but control. Veteran accounts describe Apache soldiers maintaining noise discipline longer than most, identifying movement patterns in foliage, and detecting ambush signs missed by inexperienced troops. Japanese forces relied heavily on concealment, night movement, and infiltration. Countering this required patience rather than aggression. In after-action reports, the language is restrained, enemy contact neutralized, patrol successful, no friendly casualties. What veterans later recalled, however, was the unsettling realization that sometimes contact ended before it began, and no one needed to explain how.
Wartime unity did not erase racial tension inside the U.S. military. Native American soldiers were often respected for their battlefield performance, but rarely invited into full camaraderie. Some white soldiers openly admitted fear, not fear of betrayal, but fear of proximity to men whose calm under pressure felt alien. One veteran later recalled being warned half-jokingly, "Don't surprise 'em from behind." These attitudes reflected misunderstanding more than reality. Apache soldiers followed the same chain of command and military law as everyone else, yet reputations grew quietly. Stories circulated through units, never written, rarely challenged, about men who seemed to appear without sound, who volunteered for night movement without complaint, who spoke little and observed everything. Respect grew, so did distance. In foxholes, fear bonds men together, but difference, even admired difference, can still isolate. Many Apache veterans later said they were trusted in combat and forgotten everywhere else.
After the war, stories hardened into legend. Claims emerged of entire enemy units collapsing without shots fired, of patrols ending with no trace of resistance. Historians caution against exaggeration, and they are right to do so. There is no verified U.S. military operation officially designated as an Apache-only psychological warfare initiative. But dismissing veteran testimony entirely would also be dishonest. Battlefield outcomes are not always fully documented, especially when engagements are brief, localized, and successful. What is documented is that Native American soldiers, including Apaches, were repeatedly assigned to forward movement, reconnaissance, and early contact roles. These are the most dangerous assignments in any war. When success leaves no spectacle, no prisoners, no firefights, no casualties, it often leaves no headlines. And so the line between record and memory remains thin. Not because the truth was mythical, but because efficiency rarely tells stories.
August 1945. The war ended abruptly. Celebrations filled American cities. But for many Native American servicemen, including Apaches, the transition from combat to peace was quiet and disorienting. They returned not to parades, but to reservations and rural towns, still shaped by poverty, segregation, and limited federal support. Some came home in uniform to families who had never seen a soldier in their community before. Others removed their medals before stepping off the bus. Military service had promised equality through sacrifice. The reality was more complicated. Many Apache veterans discovered that their wartime roles carried little recognition and in some cases little understanding from civilians who could not imagine the environments they had survived. They did not speak often about what they did. In many Apache families, silence was not secrecy, it was restraint. The GI Bill transformed millions of American lives, but its benefits were unevenly distributed. For many Native American veterans, access in housing loans, education, and medical care proved difficult or impossible. Remote locations, bureaucratic barriers, and discrimination slowed or denied assistance. Some Apache veterans lacked nearby Veterans Administration offices. Others faced skepticism when describing injuries that were psychological rather than physical. This neglect reinforced silence. Men who had served in some of the most dangerous environments of the war returned to communities with little institutional memory of their sacrifice. Decades later, researchers would note a troubling pattern. Native American veterans were overrepresented in combat roles and underrepresented in post-war support. The war had taken years of their lives. Peace offered few answers and fewer acknowledgments. As years passed, Apache veterans aged without public recognition. Their children grew up knowing they had served, but rarely how. In many households, war stories surfaced only in fragments, a comment about silence, a warning about the woods, a refusal to walk certain trails at night. Some veterans never spoke at all. This absence of narrative allowed others to fill the gap. Rumors grew, legends hardened. Internet-era storytelling would later exaggerate what silence had left unresolved. Yet beneath every embellished account lies a simpler truth. These men fought professionally, endured extreme conditions, and returned to a country unprepared to listen. They were not ghosts in war. They became ghosts afterward, because history only remembers what is recorded, and silence leaves no archive. For nearly 2 decades after World War II, Native American military service existed mostly in footnotes. That began to change in the 1960s as civil rights movements and tribal activism pushed historians to look beyond traditional archives. Researchers conducting oral histories encountered a challenge. Apache veterans often resisted formal interviews. Many viewed war as something done, not something explained. Others distrusted institutions that had ignored them for years. When interviews did happen, they were precise, restrained, and often incomplete. Veterans described terrain, movement, and outcomes, but avoided personal emotion. This style frustrated some historians, but others recognized it for what it was, a professional soldier's discipline maintained long after the war ended. The absence of detail was not deception, it was control. By the late 20th century, military historians and trainers began re-examining small unit warfare in jungle and forest environments. Their conclusions echoed what veterans had long known. Success in these environments depends on noise discipline, terrain literacy, patience, and psychological steadiness, not aggression. Apache soldiers did not possess supernatural abilities, but many brought lifelong familiarity with tracking, movement, and spatial awareness into modern combat training. This did not make them brutal, it made them efficient. Modern U.S. military doctrine now teaches principles once learned informally. Avoid unnecessary contact, dominate the enemy's perception, and let fear exhaust resistance before force is applied. What was once whispered in foxholes became instruction manuals decades later without names attached.
Recognition came slowly and quietly. Unlike high-profile units, Apache veterans were not commemorated through monuments or films. Instead, acknowledgement arrived through tribal ceremonies, local honors, and family remembrance. Some descendants began preserving stories once considered private. Others chose not to. Both decisions reflected respect, not loss. Government recognition of Native American World War II service expanded in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, but by then many veterans had already passed away. Their legacy is not defined by legend or brutality. It is defined by discipline under pressure, restraint in victory, and silence afterward. History did not hide everything. It simply recorded too little and listened too late.
Fear inside a combat unit does not always come from the enemy. It can also come from difference, especially when that difference performs under pressure in unfamiliar ways. Apache soldiers did not boast, celebrate kills, or recount close calls. They reported results and moved on. For some comrades, this restraint was reassuring. For others, it was unsettling. In war, predictability builds trust. Silence can feel unpredictable. Veterans later described Apache servicemen as men who watched more than they spoke and moved when others hesitated. None of this violated military discipline, but it challenged expectations of behavior shaped by civilian culture. Unease was not fear of brutality. It was fear of not fully understanding the man next to you and realizing he might understand the battlefield better than you did.
After the war, stories without context began to grow. Short comments turned into exaggerated accounts. Internet-era storytelling amplified fragments into spectacle. Claims of supernatural perception, invincibility, or ritual brutality say more about modern fascination than historical reality. Apache veterans were not mythic figures. They were trained soldiers shaped by culture, environment, and experience, no different in principle from mountain troops or jungle fighters anywhere in the world. Myth does not honor service, it replaces it. When history fails to document real contributions, imagination fills the void, and imagination rarely respects restraint. The danger is not believing too much, it is believing the wrong thing.
Strip away legend, fear, and exaggeration, and what remains is more instructive than myth. Apache soldiers demonstrated the discipline, patience, and terrain mastery can outweigh firepower. That psychological stability matters as much as aggression, and that restraint in victory is not weakness, it is professionalism. Their post-war silence was not an attempt to mystify the past. It was an extension of wartime discipline into civilian life. The tragedy is not that history hid everything. The tragedy is that history did not know how to listen to men who never needed to shout. Their story is not of brutality. It is one of control, and that is far more unsettling.
Wars do not remember everything. They remember what is documented, repeatable, and convenient. Large battles leave maps, generals leave memoirs, units with clear paper trails leave archives. Small unit success, especially when it ends quickly and quietly, often leaves nothing behind.
Apache soldiers operated inside this gap. Their effectiveness reduced casualties, shortened engagements, and prevented escalation. Ironically, these outcomes made their actions harder to record. History favors noise. Efficiency leaves little evidence. This is not unique to Apache veterans, but it affected them disproportionately because their culture valued restraint, not self-promotion. When history depends on records, and records depend on reporting, silence becomes erasure, even when that silence saved lives.
When exaggerated stories began circulating decades later, few Apache veterans stepped forward to correct them. Part of this was age, part was distrust, but part was cultural distance. For many Apache men, correcting outsiders carried little value. The war had already been fought. Survival mattered more than explanation. Speaking publicly about killing, even in war, was not considered honorable. Silence was not denial. It was dignity. This left space for others to define the narrative. And once myth replaces memory, reclaiming truth becomes difficult. The men who knew what actually happened were never interested in defending reputations they never sought. They had already done their duty and moved on.
Modern military training acknowledges principles that once went unnamed. Control the environment. Control perception. Avoid unnecessary force. These concepts appear today in reconnaissance doctrine, special operations training, and counterinsurgency manuals. They were not invented in classrooms. They were learned in forests, jungles, and night patrols, often by soldiers whose names were never recorded. Apache servicemen did not reshape doctrine alone, but their performance reinforced lessons the military would later formalize. Their influence is indirect, but real. The absence of citation does not mean absence of impact. It means the lesson was learned quietly, as it was first demonstrated.
Brutality implies excess, violence beyond necessity. What Apache veterans demonstrated was the opposite. Their effectiveness lay in avoiding chaos, minimizing exposure, and ending danger quickly. Modern audiences sometimes confuse fear with cruelty, but fear in war often comes from uncertainty, not savagery. Apache soldiers were feared because they were calm where others panicked, quiet where others rushed, and decisive when hesitation meant death. This distinction matters. To misunderstand it is to misunderstand warfare itself. Their legacy is not brutality hidden by history. It is discipline misunderstood by those looking for spectacle.
What history failed to preserve, families did. Not through detailed stories, but through habits, warnings, and silences passed down generations. Children learned that their fathers disliked crowds, that they avoided wooded trails at night, that they listened more than they spoke. These fragments were not clues meant to be decoded. They were remnants of lives shaped by war and never fully unpacked. For many descendants, understanding came late, sometimes only after the veterans were gone. Memory survived not as narrative, but as presence, and presence does not require explanation.
This story does not ask for myth. It does not ask for fear or spectacle or exaggeration. It asks for accuracy and humility. The Apache soldiers of World War II were not ghosts, monsters, or legends. They were professionals who did difficult work efficiently and returned home without demanding recognition. What history hid was not brutality, but discomfort. Discomfort with quiet men who fit poorly into loud narratives. Remembering them correctly is not about elevating one group above others. It is about understanding how many wars are shaped by those history barely records, and how silence can be both strength
and loss. Historical responsibility requires clarity. There is no evidence that Apache soldiers operated outside U.S. military law, engaged in ritual violence, or conducted unofficial executions. Those claims belong to rumor, not record. What the record does confirm is extensive Native American participation in frontline roles, high enlistment rates, repeated assignment to dangerous patrol duties, and post-war neglect. Veteran testimony, while restrained, aligns consistently on key points. Silence mattered, patience mattered, and avoiding unnecessary combat saved lives. When stripped of exaggeration, the truth remains compelling. The Apache World War II experience does not need embellishment to command respect. Accuracy does not weaken the story. It restores it.
If brutality implies cruelty, excess, or loss of control, then the word does not apply. But if brutality is understood as relentless efficiency, emotional discipline, and refusal to romanticize violence, then the discomfort surrounding Apache soldiers begins to make sense. They were not brutal in how they killed. They were brutal in how little chaos they allowed war to create. That level of control unsettles people more than aggression ever could, because it offers no spectacle, only results. History did not hide brutality. It struggled to categorize restraint.
Apache veterans did not ask to be feared. They did not ask to be mythologized. They asked, quietly, for fairness, dignity, and remembrance grounded in truth. Many never received even that. Their service lives on, not in medals or movies, but in doctrines refined, patrols survived, and soldiers who returned home because someone else remained calm in the dark. Legacy does not always announce itself. Sometimes it exists only in outcomes, and in the lives that continue because someone did their job well.
The Apache soldiers of World War II were not hidden because they were dangerous. They were overlooked because they were disciplined, quiet, and uninterested in storytelling. History prefers heroes who explain themselves. These men did not. They served, endured, returned home, and carried their experiences without spectacle. To remember them accurately is not to amplify fear or legend, but to recognize a form of courage that leaves few records and asks for no applause. They were not ghosts in war. They became invisible afterward, and now they deserve to be seen clearly.
If stories like this matter to you, stories that history recorded too quietly, consider subscribing. This channel is dedicated to preserving forgotten service, separating fact from myth, and honoring those who did their duty without demanding recognition. Subscribing helps ensure these stories are told carefully, accurately, and respectfully. Thank you for watching.